Hi, welcome back to another very special episode of Analyzed Scripts. Because one of my favorite attendings and teachers from residency, Zheala Qayyum, is joining us once again to discuss the second Harry Potter movie, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. If you haven't listened to our last episode with Dr. Q, please, go back in your feed a little bit to find our first episode about Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, because we're going to rebuild on that. And just to remind you, Zheala is the attending psychiatrist at the at Harvard, basically. She's the medical director of the Emergency Psychiatry Service and the director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program. She also remains on staff at Yale University, which is where I met her as my inpatient attending on the Child and Adolescent unit. So we love her because she's awesome and because she's so good at using fairy tales like Harry Potter to talk about development and themes about child and adolescent psychiatry. So we're just thrilled to have you back.
No, thank you for having me. And I'm so excited that I get to do something that's dear to my heart and has fascinated me since I was in medical school. So that I'm kind of giving my age away. That's when I read Harry Potter. But to do it with some of my favorite people. So I think there's nothing better.
Awesome. Well, so where do we get started, Portia?
I don't know. I mean, they're back for year 2, right? So I think the shock to Harry maybe isn't entirely over because there's new monsters and people that he's meeting every year. But the fact that there is magic out there. I guess I would start with him returning home to the Dursleys, which I have never been happy about. I think we learn later kind of why, but now I just, seeing him being so mistreated, and kind of brought all back with the trauma. Like, here we are again, you don't matter. Dudley is so amazing. Your parents were bad. It's like all these messages kind of return. So I think we should start there.
I do think it's so realistic, though, unfortunately, right? That gosh, Harry finally finds his place in Hogwarts and these people where he feels safe and loved and special. Mm-hmm. And what's awesome about Harry is the specialness isn't really what he loves the most, right? Like, he's not, seeking that part out. He just likes feeling secure and loved. And now he has to go back for the summer to this abusive environment. And I just think, unfortunately, that does mirror a lot of kids who are growing up in abusive households, that you hope they have a place to go where they can see the world won't always be like this, but he does have to go back and it totally sucks.
Yeah. It's like school, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think similarly, we see what happens in many abusive relationships, although this was not intentional and Dobby had a role to play in it, is that you get cut off from your supportive relationships.
Right.
That we're going to bolt your window. You're not going to do the things that bring you joy, or magic is not allowed. Your friends don't even care about you to write to you. And all those things that he felt like he got in the first year were just suddenly taken away. And he sort of starts believing it when he was like, maybe my friends won't come back, or I'm on my own. And maybe
why haven't they written to me?
Yeah.
A lot of self-doubt, a lot of he's still growing in confidence, still thinking about what is real and what's not. And I think the other thing which sort of contrasts is you go to the Dursleys, and everything is so, proper, and everything has to be done this way. I will come and greet them.
Yeah.
And then I think one of the stark contrasts is we get introduced to the Burrows. Which is a whole different world, and it's still a family. And then it gives you a contrast of the sort of the orderliness, the rigidness, the regimentedness at Privet Drive, and then you go to the chaos of Burrows that is full of love and caring, and yet it has room for the unexpected. Each kid is different and accepted for being dragon trainers and whatever else that they're doing.
Yeah.
I think we talked a little about this in the last one where in such a big family, Ron is a little lost. That his attachment style we talked about is a little anxious. He doesn't know if he'll get looked over. in all of this chaos, but there is just so much curiosity. I think that was one thing that is so starkly different between those two households, where the adults in Burrows are fostering curiosity and modeling curiosity for their kids. Like, what is this function of this rubber duck?
Yeah.
We're so fascinated, and yet there is no room for curiosity or thought in Privet Drive. And I
Or
think
being
that's
different. Yeah.
types of torture for a young child.
Yeah, totally.
And I think even in maybe a more stable, non-abusive home, we see that, right? In kids who maybe their parents have high expectations for them or want them to turn into X, Y, or Z and don't leave room for the child's unique personality or individuality or interests. That can happen even if you're not being abused or neglected, right? Like Harry. So I thought that was also just a beautiful addition to the story that I think imagining like kids watching it, even adults watching it, it'll resonate with them.
Mm-hmm. I think it's funny and a little like, well, what else is Mr. Dursley supposed to say when Harry's right has the cake? And it looks like he's doing it, and then it goes over right his client's wife. And then he's like, oh, that's my nephew. He's very disturbed. We didn't want him, coming down. And I mean, to non-magical people, muggles, like, I think sometimes, right, what we don't know is scary or disturbing. But I just thought it was like an interesting word choice.
Disturbed.
Because, like, I guess it fits, from a muggle's perspective of what's going on. And then also just like they think he's disturbed and they think he's unwell and weird and crazy and bad, too. But I felt bad for Hedwig. We talk usually about people, but being like stuck in her little,
cage,
not being allowed to be let out. But yes, we are introduced to Dobby, and he doesn't seem so great at first, right? He's like all this mischievous stuff. He's this new creature. And he's starting to, right? Like every time he says something not nice about his master or the family he works for, he kind of like self-harms, right? So he's like hitting himself on the head with a lamp, banging his hand down. And Harry's like, what are you doing? Like, stop, stop, stop. And I think it's so telling to Harry's right so kind and nurturing just spirit that we see again through the rest of the movies, especially with Dobby, that he's like please stop, like what are you doing, please don't do this.
Makes him uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I'm dying to hear what you think of Dobby, Dr. Q.
I think Dobby, and I think it evolves more over the next books and movies, is I think it's a bigger question of representation of race and otherness in the books, because there's not a lot of focus on race per se, and yet there is in the purebloods and the muggles and
the
the
mudbloods.
And then there's even the people who sort of are very thoughtful about how Hagrid and the Weasleys support Muggle-born wizards and witches. There is in wizarding families, there's this neglect and oversight of these elves. Like they're non-existent and invisible, and I think we see in the future books too that there are characters who really take a lot of issue with sort of this thought about pure-bloodedness, and yet they're perfectly fine with elves working in their homes. So I just think it's interesting that there's even, despite a lot of awareness, there's sort of blind spot that Hermione picks up on later in the later books about these elves are being mistreated. But then also you see someone being restricted in what they can do and genuinely care about someone, and just how their methods are not helpful.
Right. But that's such a great point. And I thought of that too in rewatching the movie again. And perhaps especially now that I'm older and the times we're living in, it was such an interesting commentary on race and identity. That's like the whole plot of this movie, right? That, Salazar Slytherin left this chamber of secrets with the basilisk that's meant to wipe out all the mudbloods, right? It's basically like the goal is genocide here, right? And we start to see like what characters are for this, which ones are against it, who is a mudblood. But even within that, exactly like what you're saying, there's this blind spot to the elves. And it's almost like could be a parallel to what we might call these days like microaggressions. Like even if you mean well, this stuff you've grown up with could still be, deeply rooted, and you got to open your eyes to it. And it's a really interesting way to start introducing that concept.
Yeah, to little kids, or
Right.
anyone. But I think it's really fascinating in terms of storytelling and fairy tales, how this big, sometimes like difficult topic is presented so well in this movie, and it's so clear. And then we see Draco seeing Harry getting all this attention when he Lockhart, right? We'll talk about him. Kind of
Oh my
brings
God,
him
I
up
have
on
so much to
stage.
say.
And Draco's so angry that, like, how dare Harry be getting all this attention? Like, I'm a pureblood. I've been taught that I should be, right, like on stage with Lockhart. Why aren't I? And then, then he's terrible to the Dursleys. And then you see his dad walk in. You're like, oh, well, this is why. But you see, and good acting, I guess, with Tom Felton, like as a child, but the rage, he's so angry.
Yeah. Right. And we really get to meet, or we start to meet the Malfoy family, right? We don't meet the mom yet, whose name is Narcissa, which I always think is interesting. But again, Zheala, I'm dying to hear what you think about the depiction of the Malfoys in this movie.
Well, it is actually, I'm really intrigued by that sort of dynamic because I also think, interestingly, I think given my own South Asian background, the whole colonialism and the British aristocracy and this sort of eliteness and classism that comes in it, and sort of, if that's the norm, how awful not to feel special and
right. Yeah. You mean for Draco?
Yes, like
right.
If this is part of your identity and this is what you've been brought up with, and then suddenly someone comes and challenges what you know. I think one of the most interesting things I was told about child development was if parents do it right, every little child should have a little bit of narcissism going into school, knowing that they're special and that they're the kings and queens of their own little kingdom. But then they come to school, and now it becomes Game of Thrones. And now you have to navigate other kings and queens. And I kind of see that happening a little later for Draco. We would expect that happening earlier in school age, but now he's sort of met someone who he can find threatening.
And so it sounds like what you're saying too is that, hopefully if you have good enough parents, they've instilled that healthy degree of narcissism in you, right? Where you are confident, you do feel special, you feel unconditionally loved. And they're not the ones challenging it maybe at first, but then hopefully they can help you wrap your head around it and say like, you are, the best to us. And there's other people around and their needs matter too, right? Like you have to balance that with some like empathy, altruism, integrity. And it's when those things are out of balance that I think we start to see personality pathology either way, whether it's more the narcissistic way or it's more of the anxious, avoidant kind of way.
Yeah, no, that's true. Because we see it again later in the movie with Hermione and Draco when she's challenging him. She challenges him academically and she's, a mudblood. But we also see her directly challenge him about his father buying the team all brooms and like, well, that's how you got in the team. And Harry didn't need that. And he's, like, how dare you call me out and like, take my crown off my head. And you're right, like someone who I consider lesser. And I think then we see them really kind of throughout the movies, which we will cover, go head to head a lot. But I think she really grinds his gears, and
that
jealous.
Scene, that scene was hard to watch even now. And just, you could tell like the word mudblood is like a racial slur, and they were all just really shocked he would even say it. It's one of those things where it's like, maybe they all kind of sense he thinks that, but then to be so, just like willing to say it so aggressively and in such a mean way. And then you see Harry not really understand.
Yeah.
Which again, what a thoughtful way to introduce that concept, right? For him as a real outsider not to get it. And now like they're having to explain it to him. Again, really, I think mirrors like trying to start to explain hard facts about the reality of the world to small children as they start to see things and ask questions.
And I think that's actually one of the loveliest things about the Harry Potter movies and books is that it parallels real life so well. Like these kind of growing pains and experiences are so normal for kids in schools. And it is developmentally appropriate. Like kids who have seen racism or racial slurs being modeled in their homes would have no qualms about saying it outside.
Right.
I think that's kind of where Draco is coming from, is we know that the father put the book in the cauldron. So he's been exposed to these. So it's not different for him, but for, like you said, for Harry, it's completely unknown. And then just how kids navigate this, like their groups and their rivalries and their exams and their classes. I think because it's so real, close to real life, that it really resonates with, it may be a different school, but it exists in our world, even if it is magical. But I think the relatability of all the challenges that these kids are seeing and experiencing is just so relatable for kids.
Yeah, no, I agree. Even thinking of just being like silly and wanting a letter, like I don't think I wanted or thought that I would be in Narnia, right? You were saying this before, Sheila, or I didn't think that I was going to be in the Lord of the Rings, but like I feel like Harry Potter is so different because it is in the real world, right? And I was like, well, maybe I could get a letter, like maybe
Like
it could come. Yeah, and I could go to this school. And I think, again, that resonates. And especially watching them grow up, like we all can reflect back on childhood moments and betrayals in friendships early on and kids being not so nice on the playground. It's like that's all so real. And whether it's, do it playing Quidditch or playing soccer, it's like it's the same feelings.
Exactly. And it's interesting in Harry Potter, I think, Zheala, you were saying this before we started recording a little bit, how, the world of Hogwarts and magic is existing in parallel to reality or like the mudblood world. And in this movie, we start to see what happens when these two worlds start to collide. And it's almost like an interesting metaphor, maybe, for what it's like for Harry to be going back and forth, or maybe for any of them to go back and forth, but how, dangerous it is to, for other people to start to recognize that there is this magical world. It kind of reminds me of like how we talk about aliens, and like, are they there? Are they not there? And just all that stuff.
We'd probably think they were an alien, right? Someone doing magic.
Or seeing a car flying through the sky.
Like 7 muggles saw that.
Yeah.
How big a deal this is.
Yeah. So they were, I'm assuming, right, probably like obliviated, which makes me think of our dear friend, which I know, Katrina, you are dying to talk about, Lockhart, and his best skill is apparently obliviating all these witches and wizards who he's stolen stories from to make him amazing.
So Zheala, please share with us your deepest, darkest thoughts about him.
Well, I think when I first see him, the most interesting thing is just how in awe Hermione is, and all the girls and the little ones. And when he comes to class, so I Gilderoy Lockhart aside, I thought it was just very interesting to see how in this book, you see crushes develop a little bit. And even for Ron and Hermione, like
at the end,
when she gets unpetrified, she goes and hugs Harry, but there's this awkwardness between Ron and Hermione, which was really, really adorable.
They just like shake hands. They're like, oh, I don't know what to do. It's so cute.
So I just felt like this was very interesting about narcissism. We were thinking about narcissism. but really Gilderoy Lockhart is. And I
Classic.
remember there was one classification somewhere in one of the papers about different types of narcissists. And there was the exhibitionistic narcissist, which was all about, look at me, I'm performing. So I kind of see him that way.
100%.
But also you see the compensatory narcissism of, I'm not good enough, so how can I make myself be more likable, more inflated, more worthwhile? Clearly he's not, he can't even do simple dueling spells.
No.
Right.
It's always,
Right.
well, if I could have stopped you if I wanted to, but for the purpose of instruction, like, I chose not to. It's like, come on.
Right. But like honestly though, what a classic narcissistic defense, right? Like that's exactly what someone with these traits or full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, that's exactly how they would respond. Right?
Oh,
And the
yeah.
fact that in the film he is so handsome and showy and there's a big crowd and he can only associate with Harry Potter, right? With like other fancy special people, not Draco, even he's not special enough, it's just like so on point. And then when we learn that actually it's all a big farce, actually he's been stealing other people's ideas and then obliviating their minds, that's like the ultimate gaslighting, right? Like it's just so perfect. I just loved the depiction of this. As we keep doing this podcast, we keep talking about narcissism so much. And I'm like, why are we seeing this everywhere? But we really are seeing it in so much different types of media. And this was just such a good spot on, I thought, representation of it. And even like the common defense mechanisms and the inner wound, it was just perfect.
And the most, I thought, cute part was when he gets obliviated himself. He's so nice.
I know.
Imagine someone without that narcissism. If you take that away from him, he was lovely.
I know. And it's so interesting, right? That it's like children who are taking it away from him, right? Who can finally like challenge him. And I think that does maybe even speak to, there's always good inside, I hope, maybe.
You
most of
see,
the time.
I think the I don't want to say like the good side of narcissism. You see the likable side of narcissism through the whole movie, and you're like, oh, well, it's not that bad. But then when he, all of a sudden it's like his mask comes off when he's
Yes.
about to obliviate them,
Right.
and like take credit, and it's like it's so ugly and different from before. Just being like showy and acting
Handsome
almost,
and
and then ooh, like there it is, like there's the calculated, kind of manipulative place that I don't know, we don't see in the rest of
exploitative side.
Exactly.
Yes. And that's the side that I think people who are in relationships with people with narcissistic traits see, that other people on the outside don't see. And I'm sure in all of our work, we have worked with children, adolescents, adults who are coping with and trying to process the pain of that.
Yeah.
Right. Because then it's not just, when you're relating to someone like that, they manipulate you to start doubting your own sense of them and sense of reality. Then you start doubting it. And then it's like everyone around you unwittingly contributes to that because they don't see the real person. Right. So again, just like, beautiful representation of that.
And I think it also points to the difference between adults and children in this, how they approach it. Because you see Snape, he knew what this guy was about. But, I mean, he did his way of sort of showing what it was like, but he never confronted him. And then you say McGonagall going and say, time has come for you to do what you're best at, right? And then he tries to run away. But none of the adults, even if they know what he's about, confronted him. They kind of played along. And I think that is also very relevant to people that you are around who might have narcissism, and people just tend to appease them and work with them because what else are you going to do? And yet the kids didn't have anything to lose, and they were able to call him out.
Right. And maybe even building on that, that's so fascinating. I think it also speaks to the danger in confronting someone with these traits. And I would say he also has some sociopathic traits, perhaps, if you're going to like obliviate children for your own gain. Like, there's a danger that comes with confronting someone like this, right? It's going to provoke what we call a narcissistic injury or narcissistic rage. Sometimes all that means is they yell at you or they stonewall you, they never talk to you again. But sometimes they could actually hurt you, like we see here, where he's then going to obliviate all of them. And maybe Snape and McGonagall, as adults with fully developed, frontal lobes, somewhere in there appreciate that. So they know how to toe the line, but children don't, right? Especially maybe at their age, they're still coping with, I would think, like that very rigid sense of right and wrong. Yes. And maybe they're struggling to see like, well, why don't you understand this is wrong? So stop doing it. But that can be dangerous to confront people like this.
No, yeah. And I think it's interesting that Dumbledore, who's like kind of to me like all knowing, it goes along with it. And I think the other professors like take their cues from him. And I wonder if Dumbledore, like in that moment, was like, leave or we're done with you. I think the other professors would have like jumped on and been like, yes, like we don't like you or you're a fraud. But he like had a very interesting, he like didn't really say anything. And he's powerful and certainly more powerful and is the person that I think could absolutely like, send him on his way without really repercussions. And he didn't.
But he
and
also probably hired him.
Yeah, hired him, right?
Why?
Yeah.
Exactly. Were they desperate?
Maybe that position, right? It's cursed. And Lockhart probably thought, well, I could do it because I'm the best that there ever was.
And I could imagine we come to find out, I don't think we know it yet, but how much Snape wants it. And I bet there's some tension there with Dumbledore not letting him take it. We see that tension with Snape come out with every single defense against the dark arts teacher over time.
True.
And then to Dumbledore's point, there was a lot more stuff happening that I think he was tied up in.
With, maybe, yeah. Like the children getting hurt.
Hagrid, being sent to Azkaban, and his own position being threatened. And I think that's the other thing. I draw the parallel of Lockhart's, popularity to social media, which is like, if someone this popular says something about you at this juncture, it's going to really impact your credibility. Because he has so many followers.
True.
Oh, that's a really good point. I thought the supporting characters in this movie were all so fascinating in their own ways. Like we've talked about some of them already. Dobby, Lockhart, the Malfoy family. I also want to make sure we leave time to talk about Moaning Myrtle, Fawkes, the Phoenix, and Tom Riddle. But before we get there, Zheala, I was hoping you could speak more to the father-son dynamic between Draco and Lucius Malfoy. And again, I think probably, it was probably intentional that they're both, white, blonde, British men, right? As you're speaking to these cultural and racial differences, like perfect casting.
It was lovely, I think, the way they selected both of them, and sort of Lucius's haughtiness and arrogance that comes through. But it also shows you his narcissism. Like the minute he finds that he was scammed by Harry for Dobby, his wand comes out.
There's that narcissistic injury. It is.
You took something from me without my permission. How dare you? And then you also have this underlying dynamic of the Slytherin family, their sort of loyalty to Salazar Slytherin, Voldemort, being Slytherin's heir who had opened the Chamber of Secrets. It is all this loyalty and alliance. And the way I would see that dynamic of it is something like father-son passed on. But I think in the later books, you also see the tension the Malfoy parents have in trying to keep their son safe.
Yeah.
And the dilemmas that their sort of poor Draco is put in and these challenging situations that they are sort of stuck with this alliance that they formed. And I also sort of draw the parallel of these are sort of the loyalties and belonging that people form to different groups that families then sort of inherit. I think one of the very poignant quotes I once read was that when we're born, we're given our name, an identity, a religion, a race, and we spend our whole lives trying to defend them. And we chose none of it.
That's so powerful and so true. I was just thinking too, like gender, even in this day and age.
Exactly. Like, and you have no control or choice in the matter. So there is a lot of, I think, modeling for Draco from Lucius. But I think later on, maybe not in this book, you kind of see their struggles of trying to know that your son belongs in this circle, and how are you going to keep him safe knowing it's dangerous, and all those things can be potentially fatal for him.
Yeah.
And I think similarly with Voldemort and Salazar Slytherin, that whole thing about true blood and belonging to, the True Blood family. Similarly, Salazar Slytherin created the Chamber of Secrets for that reason. All of that just points towards this sort of propagation. And yet it is very covert. It is hidden. It is done on the sides, which is just such a lovely parallel to what happens with racism, that yes, when you give it permission, it becomes very overt, and yet there's so many people who have it, and maybe are just acculturated, and this is their norm, that they don't realize it. And when given the opportunity, it comes up, but in other circumstances, it's very, very hidden.
And even like, it's just such a beautiful visual representation of that, right? Like even the fact that it's like in the bathroom, right? Like you can turn on the faucet and it'll flood, or you can turn it off. It can trickle, or you can go down the tube, right? It's so beautifully, masterfully done.
What do we think about snakes, right? And like the symbolism of just like the monster being a snake, the symbol,
and Harry
obviously
being able to talk to snakes.
Harry, and then in book 1 we see that right away, kind of with him hearing at the zoo.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think it's a good animal that they chose.
Yeah, right. Because snakes are kind of like a lot of people are scared of them. They're slimy, they're slithery, they kind of catch you by surprise. They can bite you and hurt you. Sometimes they're totally harmless. A quote that really stuck out to me in this movie was when Hermione told Harry, "Hearing voices no one else can hear isn't a good sign, even in the wizarding world."
True.
Which is why I think that's the parallel of how close to reality that whole place is.
Right.
But imagine hearing them, right? Like Harry, I mean, like all of a sudden you're hearing like this whooshing through the wall, and then you're hearing this voice, and everyone else is just like, what are you talking about? I mean, what a challenging ordeal to go through. And then, it is real, right? Like that, which it's kind of like, thank goodness, because then there's maybe other concerns going on if it's not. But that's hard, shouldering again. It's like he's out on this island, right? He's Harry Potter, he's unique, and now it's again like this thing that makes him unique, not really in a good way in this movie.
In a scary way. And I think we start to see him grappling with the good and bad, dark parts of himself, which it seems like he shares with Voldemort.
Yeah.
Right. And we start to see like that inner tension he has, like, should I been a Slytherin? Am I a Gryffindor? As if it's so black or white. We start to see that. Such a beautiful representation.
And I think similarly to your point, like snakes, I know from a psychodynamic perspective have a very different meaning. But I think the one thing about it is that the places they can penetrate and go. And I think that was with the basilisk, that you have Hogwarts, the safe space of, this is where magic is. This is sort of this magic central for education and learning. And yet it is penetrated by evil forces from within. And they're lurking. They're again in the shadows. I think that's the one thing about snakes, is that they hide in dark places. So I think there's this whole veil of, I read an article about this veil of concealment and deceit and deception that is very prevalent throughout all of the Chamber of Secrets, because it's a Chamber of Secrets. So
right, it's in the name.
So
Literally,
the deception, like the diary deceives Jenny. And sort of it also kind of speaks to the power of words, which can really influence people. Then the deception with the polyjuice potion, that they're able to get some information, but they have to conceal and deceive, concealment under the invisibility cloak, and concealment in a way of like Gilderoy Lockhart concealing his real identity and the truth about himself. So a lot of general themes about deception and concealment. And then I think the sort of the symbolism of the snake is also in the Garden of Eden about deception. So I think there are a lot of different themes and motifs and parallels around that. But to your point about the sort of ambivalence around your identity and belonging, and I think between him and Voldemort, the core of the wands are the same.
right.
They are both Parselmouth. They are both like raised somewhat by Muggles. He was in an orphanage. He was with the Dursleys. So very similar life experiences that they start showing, to where Dumbledore will say that it's the choices that you make that make all the difference.
Right.
You can see that with all these similarities, you can actually show kids and adults that really, just because we say someone had a very different upbringing or a difficult start or has certain traits, it's not a life sentence. And what a beautiful message to give, that even if the things are against you and you have seen other role models or people that you sort of can identify with have very different paths that are not ideal, you can still carve a different one with the choices that you make.
Right. That's so beautiful. And I think it's so important. I'd imagine, especially when you're working with kids and adolescents who are coming from difficult backgrounds, whatever they might be, even adults, but I think maybe especially when you're still forming your identity, to know that like you don't have to follow this path. You can make different choices. And that, even though there might be parts of you that remind you of, I'm just thinking about like a parent, maybe an abusive parent, or you get angry and lash out, that doesn't mean you're just like them. And I think that's something that's so painful for people to process and work through when they're trying to recover from an upbringing like that.
And I think that also speaks to corrective parenting. Like you have this McGonagall and Dumbledore parental couple in a way. That is a very stark contrast to Molly Weasley and also Petunia Dursley and Uncle Vernon, where when they think they're going to get expelled, and Professor McGonagall's response is, you're not getting expelled, but I must impress upon you the seriousness of what you've done. So they are really the sort of the modeling of good parenting. Of they are trying to protect their kids, but they are not fighting their fights for them. They are not going and intervening in every conflict. They are giving them their space to have their own adventures, come to their own conclusions, figure things out, but still being sort of neutral, supportive, guiding, wise. But they don't give the kids the answers.
Right.
And still loved, it's like, I think I wish that we got a little window into when Ginny, I'm assuming, like goes and meets her family or maybe sees her parents after the chamber. And just like, I would imagine the support that she receives because she goes on to be appearingly a secure person. And I think it's even thinking of the buildup before, like I'm sure she's felt loved and important in the way that she can with so many siblings. And she's the only girl. that
Mhm.
she's okay, even though dealing with this traumatic experience and
Mhm.
having this like relationship with Tom Riddle, right, for almost the whole school year where she's writing and just thinking about I'm just so curious about how that affected her and
Yeah.
and why she was so susceptible to it. I think
Mhm.
like she got this special book and finally she had her own thing and this person, wanted to talk to her. And of course, for her, I think it's just like
Yes.
a smart match, which Lucius, I'm sure, knew.
Yes,
Mm.
he did. These people can sniff it out, I always say.
And it also kind of sort of parallels how Draco's trying to put Harry and Hermione down, how Lucius was
Mm.
trying to put the Weasleys down by sort of planting that book, and he knew he would get Arthur Weasley into trouble because of all of this, and that was sort of the goal of if Ginny gets into trouble. So there's bigger bigger players, and yet you have the little ones who have to go through these experiences.
Mhm.
Yeah. Again, like you said, very covert and sort of maybe playing like a long game
Yeah.
and using the children really as pawns in his own game, which is pretty nasty.
Yeah, it's
Right
sad.
in line with narcissism.
Yes, that was a big.
Right in line.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, before we wrap up, Gila, I'm also dying to hear what you think about Moaning Myrtle,
Oh
who's one
yeah.
of my like
Oh,
favorite characters of all time.
love Moaning Myrtle.
Love her.
I just love the morbidity. Like I was sitting
Mhm.
in my cubicle thinking of death.
Yes. Yes.
Um,
It's like I don't know if you saw the Barbie movie that came out last summer. When they're all did you see it?
yes, yes.
When they're all dancing and she's like, y'all ever think about dying? And everyone's like, we can't go there.
Um, but what I took from Mourning Myrtle was sort of this invisibility of not being seen
Mhm.
even after death. Like people
Mm-hmm.
just come and throw another book at me. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
imagine the distress in which she died. She was crying, like she didn't even see who it was
Right?
because she was crying and
Mm-hmm.
she was distraught. Um, and just how lonely she is in that bathroom that she says, if you die, you can come to my room.
Yeah. And so different from like nearly headless Nick, who's also a ghost and walking around, but like almost revered,
Mhm.
right? Or
Pete
like they
is like the crazy one who's like up to no good. Like it's like, and she's just, in her bathroom being sad. But I really do want to say Harry's response, and I caught it this time that I watched it with my, mental health cap on. Ron is like, ew. And Harry's like, okay, sure, Myrtle. Like, that's great. And he's just so
so
kind and like
sweet.
so sweet. I don't know. It's amazing. Resilient.
And I think he can tolerate that because he knows what that feels like,
Yeah.
right? Like he just naturally, I think, will be more open to that
The,
Mhm.
and
the,
maybe not even realize it's a strength.
Yeah.
the rejection, the isolation. And I think it's just such a close parallel to kids who are being bullied in
Mm-hmm.
school, who go and hide in the bathrooms. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so real. But it also kind of tells you that that is such a impressionable time in someone's life, that these insults, she could not get over them after death even. So that was
Hmm.
part of her sadness, and the persona she carried was she wasn't seen.
Mhm.
Or if she was, it was not in a very
Yeah.
positive way.
And that those words really leave a mark,
Mm.
indefinitely in her case.
Yeah. It's sad.
Again, but an important message for kids to learn,
Mm.
maybe like as you're watching the movie.
The kindness. And also I
Mhm.
think that's the other theme that comes up through the movie, where you talked about Hermione sort of standing up to Draco, is that kids facing bullying. How do you do that? How do you stand
Mhm.
up? When to walk away versus when to actually address it.
Mhm.
I think they're just beautifully highlighted in a very subtle way, but it
Mhm.
is good
Mhm.
modeling for kids that, yes, and this is one adverse outcome, and yet here are some good, strong role models for you to see
Mhm.
who are going to come across that bully.
Mhm.
I think even, a good role model for parents, as I'm watching it now as a parent, like with my children who are younger than these kids in the movie, but are already starting to face some of these issues. Like, we don't live in an ideal world where you can just, resolve conflict with your words alone, or there's always an adult around who can intervene. Like, yes, that's the hope. But when it's not, you have to start talking to your kids about, well, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And those are hard conversations to have as a parent.
Mm. Yeah. But you're good at it, Dr. Fury.
Yes.
I hope so. We'll see. Come back in about 15 years. We'll see how everything's going.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up, are there any other, lingering thoughts or themes we want to make sure we address? I think the only other one on my mind was Fawkes the Phoenix, and how I'm going to call her a she. I don't remember Fawkes's gender. It doesn't really matter, but I've decided it's a girl like us. How she saves the day,
And Harry being a true Gryffindor, right? And that's what Dumbledore kind of reminds him of with the sword. And then you called Fawkes, which means you must have been, I think it's like true of heart, or, you are putting yourself before someone else's needs, to save them. And, thank goodness for Dumbledore, because I think he really anchored Harry. And like, I did make the choice, right, to be in Gryffindor. I asked the hat, and he was like, that's, that's the difference, which we mentioned before about the importance of our choices, despite,
Right.
what's sometimes in our environments or sometimes traits that we might have. And Fawkes is just, I love that they grow old and kind of like turn into ash, and Harry's like, oh my gosh, like what's happening? And then the little, out of death and darkness comes life and good things
and rebirth. Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Thanks for reminding us of that. That's a better way to end than
exactly
some sadness. Hope.
And I think, I think too, just again, this movie and all of Harry Potter really touches on the good and bad parts in all of us. Like, right, how we all have good and bad parts, and that's okay. And that sometimes, like if you look up the traits of a Slytherin or a Gryffindor, which I did, so Slytherin, they say, ambition, resourcefulness, determination, cleverness. That all sounds great when you channel it in the right way, but you could see how you could channel it in this sort of elitist, villainous way that Salazar Slytherin and some others have sort of evolved into. And same thing with Gryffindor, bravery, honor, loyalty, boldness. Again, channel it in a good way, or you could kind of become reckless, self-righteous, have a short temper, always want to be the hero. That can get you into trouble sometimes. But like that, the sort of, it's like a double-sided sword. Is that a thing? Where it could be good or bad depending on how you channel it. And again, that speaks to the choices that we make, and so important for kids to hear. And I think, I heard a quote somewhere, I'm going to butcher it now probably, where, I think, like, we're not responsible for the trauma we might be born into or grow up in, but we are responsible for then kind of what we do with it and how to move forward. And that's a really important point. I think we all probably use in our work with people, and maybe just as humans walking the earth.
Exactly. And I just think, to your point, the fact, well, I'll say two things. One is like, not all Slytherins are bad.
Right.
Which is, I think, something Harry bought into when he was like, please don't put me in Slytherin, when he was under the Sorting Hat. But really, I think that, to your point, one of the biggest things about the loyalty, the sacrifice, and I think that was one of the things that throughout the whole series helped Harry differentiate himself from Voldemort, is the sense of love we've internalized, which is so important for kids and us as adults and human beings, is to know we were loved, even if our parents are not around, even if those people who loved us are not in our lives. Just that sense of being loved can really change the life of a human being, which is something Voldemort did not have. And I think that just helps anchor him into, yes, if I was loved, I can sacrifice my love for others. I can be loyal to others. And and I think every child just wants to belong.
Of course.
Wanted to belong to Hogwarts.
Yeah. And I think Harry, although he lost his parents so early, I think it's deep down, he knows he was loved, and he's constantly told that over and over, right, about his life story. So even though he didn't have it for very long, somewhere in there, he knows it, and he's reminded of that, which is so important for kids.
Yeah.
And when you don't have it, you're really vulnerable to nefarious people out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, gosh, what a great way to start my day. This was just such a treat. Thank you so much for joining us, Zheala. We love you for all the reasons. And I guess, do you want to tell everyone where they can find you on Instagram?
Sure. It's ZheeQue, and hope to be part of these in the future.
Oh my gosh. Yes, we would love to have
This
you
is our
back
Harry
for the
Potter
next
journey.
book. Yes, we're on a journey too. And again, thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can find us at Analyze Scripts Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and on YouTube now if you want to watch this episode. And we will see you again next Monday for our next episode.
Great. Bye.
All right. Bye.